So this lecture is going to be on the European explorers, starting with the Portuguese explorers. And remember, they were the first Europeans to really start the age of exploration, and their goal was to sail to the Indies, which was also known as Asia. So Portugal began looking for a sea route to the Indies, also known as Asia, in the early 1400s. And their leader was Prince Henry the Navigator, who was the son of Portugal. And their big goal was to find gold, so become really wealthy, fight Muslims. Remember, they're a very Catholic country. They're still kind of at odds with the Muslim community. And their biggest goal was to sail around Africa to get to India, to get the spices and the silks. Now, Henry, he sent explorers along the coast of Africa. And remember, he never actually went on an expedition, but he paid for schools, he paid for funding, he encouraged exploration. And his explorers were supposed to map the coast of Africa, chart the currents and the winds so that each ship benefited from the ships that came before it. And then in 1488, a Portuguese ship finally got to the southern point in Africa, but the sailors mutinied and refused to go any further. And that captain was Bartholomew Diaz, and again, he made it to the southern tip of Africa. You can kind of see it better in this picture, but then his crew mutinied and he had to go back. And then this map shows kind of the two major Portuguese explorers. The route of Vasco da Gama is in red, and the route of Pedro Cabral is in green. And if you remember from class today, da Gama is the one who makes it around the Horn of Africa, or the tip of Africa, all the way to India, and then back. And Pedro Cabral, while trying to avoid the parts of the sea that were where there was no wind, he accidentally hits Brazil. So, about 10 years after that crew made it to the tip of Africa and returned back to Europe, in 1498, Vasco da Gama sails around Africa. He sailed up the coast, and he was guided by an Arab or Muslim pilot and reached Calcutta in India. Now, again, this is the guy who set sail with 4 ships. 2 of them sank on the return journey, but the spices that he brought back brought a huge profit for Portugal. So it just only encouraged exploration even further. And then a later explorer, Pedro Cabral, accidentally found Brazil on his way to India. Now, the results of Portuguese exploration are pretty important. As a result of Portuguese exploration, Portugal acquired colonies in Brazil, Africa, and India. So we kind of start to see the beginning of colonies. Portugal also gained control over the spice trade. They were the first ones to establish routes by sea. So they were able to kind of dominate the spice trade by sea and bring back tons of goods from Asia. And this is just going to encourage more European countries to explore. They did drop the price of Asian goods, so more people were able to afford them. So now you see like more peasants being able to afford spices and silks. And then a real negative effect of Portuguese exploration is that they began bringing African slaves to Brazil, and it's the start of the American or Atlantic slave trade. So this is going to have a big impact for centuries after the start of exploration. And finally, other countries got jealous of the wealth and prosperity that Portugal had because of exploration, so they began exploration as well. And that would be the Spanish and the English explorers. So we can kind of see, and they sailed west, and we'll get into that in a moment. So the early Spanish explorers were Columbus and Magellan, and you can see their routes here. Columbus is in red, Magellan is in green. And Spain wasn't really able to start exploration until the 2 rulers were finished one of their, to-do tasks. So in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the rulers of Spain, were focused on defeating the last Muslims in Spain. So remember that the Islamic Empire had spread into southern Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella were trying to defeat them. They finally did in 1492. They defeated the Kingdom of Granada in southern Spain, so they controlled all of Spain. And once they had done that, they agreed to finance Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus had gone to the Portuguese Portuguese monarchs and said, "I want to go sailing and exploring for you." They turned him down, so he went over to the Spanish rulers, and they said that they would be willing to fund his trip. And here we have a map of Spain. You can see all of the different kingdoms. And so under Ferdinand and Isabel, they were all united under those two rulers. So the Spanish rulers wanted to benefit from trade with the Indies or Asia, so again, like Portugal, but they would have a problem with Portugal if they tried to sail around Africa. So it's kind of like a competition. Spain can't go where Portugal's been going. Christopher Columbus had a plan to sail west, so he planned to sail in the opposite direction and make it to Asia. So his plan seemed like a good alternative. And he ultimately made 4 trips to America, but he never believed it was a new continent. He always thought he was just off the coast of Asia. And unfortunately, he didn't find a lot of great wealth, but later Spanish explorers would. Now, this is where things get a little tricky. So Spain and Portugal were very Catholic, and they were trying to compete for trade routes with India and Asia. And so the Pope didn't want them competing for sea routes, so he drew a line in 1494 dividing the new lands between Portugal and Spain to try to avoid a war between these two Catholic countries. So you can see in the little map here, Spain got to go west and Portugal got to go east to get trade routes to Asia. And that's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And a later Spanish explorer was Ferdinand Magellan, and he sailed in 1519 to try to sail all the way around America to get to the Indies. And Spain sponsored his voyage, and his voyage was the first one to sail completely around the world, even though most of the men died, including Magellan, who died just before reaching home. He's the one who set out with 5 ships and 250 men, and most of them died. I think 18 returned home. And Spain gained a lot of great wealth and set up many colonies as one of the results of their exploration. They also found a lot of gold and silver, which led to inflation. So much gold was brought back to Spain after they had explored Central and South America that it actually ended up hurting their economy. A negative thing that happened because of Spanish exploration was they brought a lot of diseases to America that killed off most of the Indians or the natives in those continents. And then we have our English explorer. So England began exploring in North America in the early 1600s, and Henry Hudson explored Canada and New York, mostly looking for a sea route to the Pacific, which he never found because he was trying to explore Canada in the winter.